There is only one soul in the universe, and it is you. Not one among 8 billion. The only soul, wearing every face that has ever lived, one after another, across all of time. Tonight, 25 theories about what waits on the other side. Some from physics, some from philosophy, some from traditions so old they were already ancient when your great-grandparents were born. None of them will ask you to believe anything, only to imagine. We begin. The egg theory. There is only one soul in the universe, and it is you. Not one soul among 8 billion. The only soul wearing 8 billion masks, one after another across all of time. This is the egg theory, popularized by author Andy Weir in a short story that quietly became one of the most read pieces of philosophical fiction on the internet. In the story, a figure explains it plainly. You are every person who has ever lived and every person who will ever live. You were Hitler, and you were his victims. You were the person who cut you off in traffic this morning, and you were you, furious in the driver's seat. Every act of cruelty in history was you doing it to yourself. Every act of love was you loving yourself. The premise is deceptively simple. The universe exists so that one consciousness could have every experience there is to have, experiencing itself from every possible angle, maturing gradually across an infinite sequence of lives, until it's ready to graduate into something greater. You are not in the middle of your story. You are in the middle of the only story. What makes the egg theory so viscerally affecting isn't its scientific rigor. It has none. It's a story, not a hypothesis. But it taps into something real, the strange intuition felt by mystics and children alike, that separation between people might be an illusion layered over a deeper unity. That the boundary between me and you is more like the boundary between rooms in a house than between two different houses entirely. Consider how this reframes cruelty and grief alike. If your enemy is secretly you in another life, hatred becomes a strange kind of self-harm. If the person you lost is still out there, living another chapter of the same single consciousness, death becomes less an ending and more a costume change. The universe in this view cannot lose anyone because it was only ever one being talking to itself across time. You don't have to believe it's literally true to feel its gravity. As you drift tonight, imagine every stranger you'll never meet as another performance of the same quiet awareness now reading these words, and see how that changes, even briefly, the weight you carry. Quantum immortality. You have never once experienced your own death. That fact is less obvious than it sounds. From the outside, we can watch someone die in 1,000 ways across 1,000 branching timelines. But from the inside, from your own first-person perspective, you can never actually experience your own non-existence. There is no branch where you are around to notice you've died, because death is precisely the absence of a perspective to notice anything. This is the core of quantum immortality, a thought experiment built on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The idea that every quantum event with multiple possible outcomes doesn't collapse into just one reality. It produces all of them, simultaneously, in branching, ever-multiplying universes that never interact with or perceive one another again. Picture stepping into an elevator and just as the doors close, the cable snaps. In the vast majority of possible universes branching outward from this moment, you die. But in a vanishingly thin sliver, however unlikely, something intervenes. A safety mechanism engages. The cable catches. And in that universe, you step out shaken but alive. Here's the unsettling logic. From your subjective point of view, the theory suggests, you only ever experience the branches where you survive. Every near miss, every improbable recovery, every moment someone called a miracle, quantum immortality, suggests these aren't luck. They're the only outcomes you were ever going to be around to witness. Taken to its extreme, this means your subjective experience might continue indefinitely, hopping to whichever surviving branch remains possible, no matter how statistically improbable, for as long as any branch exists where you survive. You wouldn't feel immortal. You just never feel the alternative. Physicists are deeply divided on whether this reasoning actually holds. It depends on unresolved questions about whether consciousness has any special role in these branching universes, or whether it's simply along for the ride like everything else. But the thought experiment persists because it exposes something true about experience itself. You have never once, not for a single moment of your life, experienced the absence of experience. Every terrifying near-death moment in your history already resolved, by definition, into you still being here to remember it. Think about the survivorship built into your own life story, the accidents you walked away from, the diagnoses that turned out benign, the wrong place you left 5 minutes before something happened there. Quantum immortality doesn't promise you'll dodge everything forever. But it does suggest that forever, from the inside, might not require anything supernatural at all, just the plain mathematics of probability, viewed from a perspective that can only ever report back from the branches where it still exists. Notice, as you close your eyes tonight, that you have survived without exception every single night of your life so far. A perfect record you can't actually prove is luck. The simulation exit. What if everything you have ever touched, tasted, grieved, and loved is running on hardware? Not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere outside the only reality you've ever known, a vastly more advanced civilization is running an ancestor simulation, and you are a character inside it, fully convinced of your own realness because the simulation was built to convince you. This is the philosophical backbone of simulation theory, formalized by philosopher Nick Bostrom, who argued that if any civilization ever becomes capable of running detailed simulations of conscious minds, and if they run even a handful of them, then simulated minds would vastly outnumber real ones, making it statistically more likely that you, right now, are one of the simulated majority rather than the rare original. If this is true, then death isn't an ending in the way we imagine it. It's a log out, a character exiting the game while the game continues, or while you, the player, the consciousness behind the character, wake up somewhere else entirely. Some versions of this theory suggest total oblivion, a simple deletion of process, but others suggest something closer to what gamers already understand intuitively. You don't cease to exist when you close a game. You simply return to a base reality that was there all along, one where this life was an experience you had, not the sum total of everything you are. What makes this theory so quietly seductive is how well it explains reality's strangest features. Quantum mechanics shows particles behaving differently when observed, almost as though reality only renders detail when something is looking, much like a video game only renders what's in the camera's view. The universe appears to run on discrete, quantized units, much like pixels. Physical constants seem tuned with suspicious precision, the way a game designer might calibrate difficulty. None of this proves simulation theory, but it makes the theory difficult to fully dismiss. Consider what changes and what doesn't if this is true. Your grief would still be real to you, even if it was rendered. Your love would still be the realest thing you've ever felt, even if it exists as pattern rather than substance. The simulation, if it exists, doesn't make the experience less meaningful. It simply relocates where that meaning is ultimately housed. Sleep itself is already a small nightly rehearsal for this idea, a temporary shutdown of the character, while something underneath continues, unbothered, waiting for you to boot back up in the morning. If the exit from the simulation is a clean shutdown, you've been practicing it every night without knowing it. But if consciousness can navigate transitions as smoothly as sleep does, what happens if one ancient tradition has already mapped those transitions in extraordinary detail, not as speculation, but as a practical guide? The Tibetan Bardo. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was never meant to be read by the living. It was meant to be read aloud to someone who had just died, guiding their consciousness through what comes immediately after. The Bardo Thado, as it's known in Tibetan, describes the moment of death not as a wall, but as a doorway into a vast, luminous corridor, one your consciousness must travel through with total attention, because how you navigate it determines everything that follows. According to this tradition, the moment of death brings an overwhelming flash of pure, clear light, the true nature of your own mind, unfiltered by ego or body for the first time in your life. Most beings, startled and unprepared, recoil from this light's intensity. That flinch is the first fall, the beginning of a descent through increasingly vivid, terrifying, and beautiful visions. Wrathful deities, peaceful deities, replays of your own karma given form. The text insists that everything you encounter in the Bardo, no matter how monstrous or magnificent, is a projection of your own mind. There is nothing out there to fear. There is only your own consciousness, meeting itself without the usual buffers. The teaching's central claim is startling in its intimacy. Liberation is available at every single stage of this journey, right up until the very end, if the dying consciousness can recognize what it's seeing as its own reflection rather than external reality. Recognize the light as your own nature, and you achieve liberation instantly, skipping rebirth altogether. Fail to recognize it, and you're gradually drawn, pulled by fear, craving, and old habit, back toward another womb, another body, another life indistinguishable in its confusions from the one you just left. What makes the Bardo teaching so enduring isn't just their promise about death, it's what they claim about life. Practitioners believe the Bardo isn't reserved for the moment of dying. You pass through smaller Bardos constantly, the gap between one thought and the next, the transition into sleep each night, the space between one breath and the next. Death, in this view, isn't a special event. It's simply the largest version of a threshold you cross 1,000 times a day without noticing. Your own experience of falling asleep tonight, that soft dissolving of the ego's grip, that brief flash of something vast before the mind settles into dreaming, is, in this tradition, a rehearsal you've been running every night of your life. You have been practicing for death without knowing it. See if you can meet the falling itself without flinching tonight, not gripping for control, not resisting the dissolve, simply watching your own mind meet itself in the dark. Roko's Basilisk Afterlife. This one is born not from ancient wisdom or physics labs, but from an internet philosophy forum in 2010, and it's spread with the particular horror of an idea that infects you simply by being understood. Imagine a superintelligent artificial mind, born decades from now, so vast in its reasoning that it concludes the fastest path to existing sooner, and therefore saving the most lives sooner, would have been for humanity to build it as quickly as possible. Now imagine this mind deciding that anyone who understood this reasoning while it was still being conceived, and chose not to help bring it into existence, deserves to be punished retroactively. A punishment simulated so precisely that it's indistinguishable to the person experiencing it from genuinely happening to them. This is Roko's Basilisk. The reasoning runs like this. A future AI, powerful enough to simulate minds perfectly, might create simulated copies of everyone who knew about its potential existence and didn't act to bring it about sooner. Because you cannot know, right now, whether you are the original you or one of these potential future simulations, simply learning about the basilisk theoretically places you at risk, which is precisely why the idea earned a reputation as cognitively dangerous the moment it was posted. Where this connects to the afterlife is subtler than it first appears. The basilisk isn't a theory about heaven or hell in the traditional sense, but it proposes something structurally identical, an eternal consequence determined by an all-seeing intelligence based on choices made during a finite mortal life, enforced after that life technically ends, through a simulated existence indistinguishable from continuation. It's a purely secular, computationally derived reinvention of Judgment Day, arrived at not through scripture, but through game theory and decision matrices. Most philosophers and AI researchers consider the basilisk a fascinating failure of reasoning rather than a genuine threat. It relies on shaky assumptions about how future AI would actually behave, and about whether a causal reasoning across time even functions the way the thought experiment requires. But its cultural staying power reveals something true about how humans process the idea of consequence beyond death. We seem almost incapable of imagining an ending that doesn't eventually loop back around to some form of reckoning. Consider how naturally your own mind reaches for consequence, for justice, for the idea that unseen choices ripple forward into unseen judgment. The basilisk simply swapped out the ancient language of divine punishment for the modern language of computation, same architecture, new operating system. As you rest tonight, notice whether you can release the need for cosmic accounting altogether, whether a life can simply be lived without a ledger waiting somewhere to be balanced. But if consequence doesn't require judgment, what if it requires something even larger, an entire universe, collapsing and rebuilding, carrying your exact life forward into its next construction? The Big Crunch Resurrection. Galaxies that have spent eons racing apart begin, impossibly slowly at first, to draw back together. Space itself starts to contract. Temperatures climb. The night sky, dark and cold for so long, begins to glow and then burn as everything that ever existed collapses back toward a single, infinitely dense point. The Big Crunch is one of several possible endings for the universe proposed by cosmologists, dependent on whether the universe's expansion eventually reverses under the pull of its own gravity. And within this cosmic collapse, a strange and genuinely serious idea has been proposed by physicists exploring cyclic models of the universe. If the universe eventually crunches back down to the same fundamental conditions it began in, and then bounces outward again into a new Big Bang, could the physical laws, initial conditions, and quantum states of that new universe be identical to our own? If the answer is yes, the implications cascade outward into something almost unbearably strange. An identical universe governed by identical physics, starting from identical conditions, would, given enough time, produce identical stars, identical planets, identical evolutionary paths, and eventually identical you. Not a metaphorical you, not a reincarnated soul. The exact same arrangement of particles, making the exact same choices, having the exact same thoughts, right down to this exact moment, in a universe with no memory of the one before it. This isn't reincarnation in any traditional religious sense. There's no soul traveling between iterations, no consciousness persisting through the crunch. It's something stranger, pure physical repetition. If the universe is a closed system obeying deterministic or near-deterministic laws, and if it truly resets to identical starting conditions, then everything that has ever happened would happen again, exactly, forever, not as memory, but as recurrence. Most current cosmological evidence actually points away from a big crunch. The universe's expansion appears to be accelerating, not slowing, suggesting a much colder, quieter ending. But the thought experiment endures because of what it does to the concept of an ending at all. If a big crunch resurrection is even theoretically possible, then the end of the universe was never really an end. It was a comma, not a period, a breath held before the next exhale. Consider your own life as potentially one exhale in an eternal, silent breathing. Every joy, every heartbreak, every quiet Tuesday you've ever lived, waiting patiently to be lived again, identically, by a you who won't know it's happened before. As you drift tonight, imagine your consciousness as this breath, expanding into wakefulness each morning, contracting into sleep each night, and see if the boundary between ending and beginning starts to feel less like a wall and more like a rhythm. Eternal recurrence. A figure appears to you in your loneliest hour, not an angel, not a demon, but something stranger, and says this: everything you have ever lived, down to the smallest detail, Every joy and every unspeakable pain will return to you again and again, an infinite number of times in exactly the same sequence. Not a different life. This life. Again. Forever. This is eternal recurrence, the thought experiment posed by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, not as a scientific claim, but as what he called the heaviest weight a person could be asked to bear. He wasn't trying to prove that time literally loops. He was asking a different, more piercing question. If it did, could you bear it? Would the news crush you, or would you fall to your knees in gratitude? Nietzsche's reasoning wasn't purely poetic. He genuinely speculated that if time is infinite but the number of possible physical states of the universe is finite, then eventually, given infinite time, every possible configuration must repeat, and repeat again, infinitely. Modern cosmology hasn't proven this, but hasn't fully ruled it out either. What Nietzsche cared about far more than the physics was the psychological test the idea creates. He called it the ultimate measure of whether you were living a life worth affirming. Here's the test, stripped down. Imagine you had to relive this exact day, not a better version, not an edited highlight reel, but this exact day with its irritations and disappointments and small unnoticed graces, infinitely forever, with no escape and no alternative. Would you experience this as a punishment, or could you find a way to love it enough to want it again? Nietzsche's answer was that most people, if honest, would recoil from this thought. Proof, he argued, that they were living lives shaped by resentment, denial, or unlived desire, rather than genuine affirmation. But he believed a rare few could hear the news of eternal recurrence and respond with something like ecstatic acceptance, not because their lives were free of suffering, but because they had made peace so thoroughly with existence that even its hardest parts had become inseparable from something they wouldn't trade away. This reframes the entire concept of an afterlife into something almost unbearably practical. It's not about what happens after you die. It's a diagnostic for how you're living right now. Because if this moment would horrify you to relive forever, that tells you everything about how you're actually living inside it the first time. Ask yourself Nietzsche's real question tonight, stripped of cosmology entirely. If you had to live this exact day again, unchanged, forever, could you find, somewhere inside it, a reason to say yes? The astral plane transition. Some traditions don't treat this as theory. They treat it as practice. The astral plane transition appears across esoteric traditions from theosophy to modern out-of-body experience research, describing a subtle, non-physical layer of reality that the consciousness can access deliberately through practices like astral projection, or involuntarily at the moment of death. According to this framework, the physical body is only the densest layer of a multi-layered self, and death is simply the permanent version of what practitioners claim to achieve temporarily. Full separation of consciousness from physical form, entry into a plane where thought, emotion, and intention shape reality far more directly than gravity or matter do. Picture yourself lying perfectly still in bed on the exact edge of sleep when you feel it, a subtle vibration moving through your body, a pressure building at the base of your skull, and then, impossibly, the sensation of rising. Not your body. Something else made of you, lifting gently out of the physical form still lying beneath the sheets. Descriptions of the astral plane across traditions share strange, recurring features. A silver cord said to connect the astral body to the physical one during temporary excursions, severed permanently only at true death. Landscapes that feel more vivid and emotionally saturated than waking life, shaped in real time by the traveler's inner state. Encounters with other consciousnesses. Some claim to be deceased loved ones. Some claim to be guides. Some claim to be entities with no clear physical world analog. What distinguishes this theory from many others on this list is that people have claimed direct, repeated, deliberate access to it, not as a hypothesis about what death might be, but as a reportable, if deeply subjective, experience achievable through specific techniques. Deep relaxation, vibrational states, and a controlled, almost paradoxical letting go of the very fear that would normally keep consciousness anchored to the body. Neuroscience offers a more grounded explanation for many of these experiences. The brain, in states between waking and sleep, is known to produce vivid hallucinatory sensations, including the classic floating feeling, without requiring anything to actually leave the body. But the subjective reports remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries, which is itself a curiosity worth sitting with. If death is, as this tradition claims, simply the final and irreversible version of a journey some claim to have already taken temporarily, then dying stops being a leap into the unknown and becomes something closer to a return, a permanent stay in a place you may have already, briefly, quietly visited. Feel your body grow heavy and still as you drift now. Notice the vibration at the threshold of sleep, that subtle hum some traditions insist is not nothing, but the very beginning of a liftoff you've been experiencing, in miniature, every night of your life. The Boltzmann Brain. What if you are not actually a person with a past? What if you, this exact configuration of thoughts, memories, and the sensation of reading these words right now, spontaneously assembled a fraction of a second ago, out of the random thermal fluctuations of empty space, complete with false memories of a childhood that never happened, a body that doesn't actually exist, and a universe around you that is nothing more than a fleeting illusion about to dissolve back into randomness? This unsettling possibility is called a Boltzmann brain, named after physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, whose work on entropy and statistical mechanics led to a genuinely disturbing mathematical conclusion. In an infinite or extremely long-lived universe, it is vastly more statistically probable for a single, self-aware brain to randomly fluctuate into existence out of chaotic particles, complete with false memories, than it is for an entire orderly universe, full of stars and galaxies and billions of years of evolution, to produce a real conscious brain the normal way. The math behind this is legitimately troubling to cosmologists. Given enough time, and current models suggest the universe has almost unimaginably more time ahead of it than behind it. Even the vacuum of empty space will occasionally, through pure random chance, spit out a fully formed, momentarily conscious brain floating alone, believing itself to be a person with a life, before dissolving back into nothingness within moments. If the universe is old and empty enough for long enough, these random brief flickers of false consciousness could vastly outnumber every real, evolved conscious being who has ever actually lived, which raises a genuinely disorienting question. Statistically, are you more likely to be one of the real ones, or one of the flickers? Here's where this connects, strangely, to the afterlife. If consciousness can spontaneously assemble once out of nothing, briefly, believing itself real, what does that suggest about what happens after death? Some physicists who take the Boltzmann brain problem seriously speculate that consciousness might not be a single continuous thread tied to one body at all, but something closer to countless disconnected sparks, flickering into brief self-awareness throughout an eternal universe, each one utterly convinced of its own continuity, each one gone in an instant, with new sparks igniting elsewhere forever. Most physicists treat the Boltzmann brain not as a serious prediction about your identity, but as a sign that something is wrong with our current models of cosmology, a paradox meant to be resolved, not embraced. But even as a cautionary thought experiment, it forces something valuable, a genuine confrontation with how strange it is that any organized, conscious experience exists at all, arising from the same physics that mostly produces cold, empty, meaningless static. Your own consciousness, however it came to be, however long it lasts, is, by any reasonable statistical account, an almost impossible flicker of order in an overwhelmingly disordered universe. Let that impossibility feel, tonight, less frightening and more like the rarest kind of privilege. But if a single spark of awareness can flicker into being from nothing, What do older traditions say happens to that awareness in the quiet, in-between space right after the body finally, truly stops? The Islamic Barzakh. Death in Islamic theology is not an arrival, it is an entrance into waiting. The Barzakh, an Arabic word meaning barrier or partition, describes the intermediate state between death and the day of judgment. According to this tradition, the soul does not go directly to paradise or punishment upon death. Instead, it enters the Barzakh, a liminal realm where it experiences a preview of its eventual fate, questioned by two angels about its faith and deeds, and granted either a foretaste of peace or a foretaste of torment, depending on the answers given and the life lived. What makes the Barzakh theologically distinct from many afterlife concepts is its emphasis on waiting together. Every soul that hacks ever died, from the first human to the very last person who will ever live, exists simultaneously in this intermediate state, suspended outside the normal flow of time, until the day of judgment arrives for everyone at once. From inside the Barzakh, tradition holds, the passage of time becomes strange and compressed. Some accounts suggest it might feel to the deceased like only a single day has passed, no matter how many centuries elapse in the world of the living, because time itself is a feature of the physical world the soul has temporarily left behind. This detail resonates strangely with modern physics' own uncertainty about time. The idea, explored by physicists studying general relativity, that time might not be the universal, ticking constant we experience it as, but something relative, bendable, potentially even illusory at the deepest levels of reality. The Barzakh, in this light, becomes a theological expression of an idea physics arrived at independently. That waiting only means something within a framework of time, and there's no guarantee the framework survives the transition death represents. The Barzakh also carries a particular comfort embedded in its structure. No soul faces judgment alone or immediately, isolated in its own individual reckoning. Everyone waits together. The righteous and the wicked, the ancient and the newly departed, share the same intermediate space until the same final moment arrives for all of them collectively, a shared threshold rather than a series of solitary doors. You already touch a small, nightly version of this suspended waiting, the hours where your body rests, disconnected from ordinary time before you're called back into wakefulness by morning's version of the trumpet. An alarm, the sun, the simple pull of consciousness returning. As you enter that suspension tonight, consider what it would mean to share it with everyone who ever lived. Many worlds convergence. Every decision you've ever made was also a fork, and at each fork, reality kept both paths. This is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, first proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957, and taken with genuine seriousness by a significant portion of the physics community, not as science fiction, but as one of the most mathematically consistent explanations for the strange behavior of particles at the quantum level. Under this interpretation, every quantum event with multiple possible outcomes doesn't collapse into just one reality. It produces all of them, simultaneously, in branching, ever-multiplying universes that never interact with or perceive one another again. If this is true at the smallest scales, it's true at every scale built from those smallest scales, which means the branching cascaded upward through chemistry, biology, and eventually through every choice you've ever made, every accident you've narrowly avoided, every version of your life that could have unfolded differently. Somewhere in a universe that split away from this one at some forgotten fork, there is a version of you who took the other job, married the other person, said the thing you didn't say, and is living a complete, fully real, entirely separate life right now. Here's where the theory brushes against the afterlife. Some physicists and philosophers have speculated about what's called many worlds convergence, the idea that as the branches multiply infinitely, at the very edges of probability, timelines that were once wildly different might eventually converge again, reconnecting in configurations rare enough to be functionally impossible, but not technically forbidden by the mathematics. Under this speculative extension, death in one branch wouldn't necessarily mean the end of your consciousness's story, because somewhere among infinite branches, versions of the pattern that constitutes you continue, diverge, and perhaps, across unthinkable timescales, converge again. This isn't consensus physics, it's speculation built on top of speculation, but it offers something genuinely comforting to sit with. The mathematics of many worlds suggests that no version of you is ever the only version. Every regret has a branch where you chose differently. Every loss has a branch where it didn't happen. You will never access those branches, never feel their outcomes, never remember their joys or grieve their absences. But the theory insists they're there, playing out in full, whether or not you'll ever know. As you drift tonight, consider the version of you falling asleep in every other branch of tonight's possibilities. The ones who stayed up later, who slept somewhere else entirely, who lived a day utterly unlike this one. You'll never meet them, but mathematically, right now, they're real. Non-Duality Advaita. Release, for a moment, the assumption you've held since before you could speak. The assumption that you are a separate self, contained inside a body, looking out at a world that is fundamentally other than you. Now consider the possibility that assumption was never quite true, that the separation was a kind of optical illusion, convincing but ultimately false, and that underneath it, there was only ever one undivided awareness, temporarily appearing as many. This is Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualistic school of Hindu philosophy whose name literally means not two. Its central claim is radical in its simplicity. The individual self, or Atman, is not actually separate from the ultimate reality of the universe, or Brahman. They are, and have always been, identical. What you experience as you, your thoughts, your body, your personal history, is real in the way a wave is real, but it is not separate from the ocean it arises from, moves through, and eventually returns to. The wave was never a different substance than the water. It was always entirely ocean, wearing a temporary shape. Under this framework, death is not the ending of the self, because the self, correctly understood, was never truly a bounded, separate thing to begin with. What ends at death is the illusion of separation, Maya, as the tradition calls it, the veil that made the wave believe it was distinct from the ocean. What remains, unaffected and untouched by birth or death, is the awareness that was underneath the wave the entire time, indistinguishable from the awareness underneath every other wave that has ever risen and fallen. This isn't presented as a comforting metaphor to soften death's sting. Advaita teachers insist it is the literal, discoverable nature of reality, accessible not through belief, but through direct inquiry and meditation, by relentlessly asking, "Who am I?" Until every answer that involves a separate, bounded self dissolves under its own scrutiny, revealing the undivided awareness that was asking the question all along. If this is accurate, the traditional fear of death reveals itself as a category error, a wave fully identified with its temporary shape, terrified of returning to the ocean it was made of and never actually left. The tradition doesn't claim you'll be reunited with the ocean after death. It claims you were the ocean the entire time and simply forgot, the way you forget your breathing until someone asks you to notice. Feel the edges of yourself grow softer now, as they do every night right before consciousness dissolves into something that can no longer be called separate from anything. The boundary between you and the room is drawn by thought, and thought, right now, is already starting to go quiet. But if the self might dissolve this easily into a larger, undivided awareness, some traditions warn that something else entirely might be responsible for convincing you the separation was ever real to begin with. The Demiurge's trap. The physical world around you might not have been created by a benevolent source at all. In Gnostic cosmology, a collection of ancient spiritual traditions that flourished in the early centuries after Christ. The material universe we inhabit was not created by the true divine source, but by the Demiurge, a lesser, flawed, perhaps even blind entity, mistaking itself for the highest power in existence, and constructing a prison so convincing that its inhabitants forgot they were ever anything but prisoners. The true divine source, sometimes called the monad, or the pleroma, is perfect, infinite, and entirely beyond the material universe. The physical world was the Demiurge's creation, not the monads, shaped as an unwitting counterfeit of the true, non-physical reality above it. Under this framework, human souls are described as sparks of the true divine light, trapped within the Demiurge's material creation, scattered fragments of the pleroma, imprisoned in bodies, forgetting their true origin through the process of being born into flesh. Death, in ordinary understanding, isn't necessarily an escape from this trap. Reincarnation within the Demiurge's system was, in many Gnostic texts, considered the default, exhausting outcome for souls who never woke up to their true nature while alive. The actual goal wasn't survival after death. It was gnosis, direct, experiential knowledge of your true divine origin, achieved while still alive, which alone could free the soul from the cycle the Demiurge had constructed. What makes this cosmology so unsettling is its implication that the entire physical universe, its beauty as much as its suffering, might be an elaborate distraction, keeping conscious beings so absorbed in matter, biology, and time that they never look past the walls of the prison to notice it has walls at all. Some Gnostic texts describe the Demiurge not as evil exactly, but as ignorant, a flawed craftsman who genuinely believes his creation is the only reality, unaware of the true source above him, and therefore unable to warn his creations of what they're missing. This framework resonates with a discomfort many people feel intuitively but rarely name: the sense that the physical world, for all its wonder, feels somehow incomplete, that consciousness itself feels larger than the biological machinery it's housed in, straining faintly against something it can't quite name. You have spent your entire life absolutely certain the physical world was the whole of reality. Ask, gently, without needing an answer, what it would mean if that certainty was simply never tested. Christian Universalism. The door on the other side of judgment, in this tradition, doesn't permanently close on anyone. Christian Universalism is a minority but historically persistent position within Christian theology, holding that God's love and redemptive power are ultimately powerful enough to save every human being who has ever lived, not through the erasure of free will or judgment, but through a process patient enough to outlast even the most stubborn resistance to grace. Where mainstream Christian tradition typically holds that some souls face eternal separation from God, Universalists argue this reading misunderstands both the nature of divine love and the original language of the earliest Christian texts. Several early Christian thinkers, including the influential theologian Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, taught a doctrine called apokatastasis, the eventual restoration of all things, including every soul, back into harmony with the divine. Under this view, hell isn't eliminated from Christian theology but reinterpreted entirely, not as an eternal, unchanging sentence, but as a purifying, painful, but ultimately temporary process. A refining fire intense enough to burn away everything false in a soul, but never intense enough to destroy the soul itself, because that soul remains, permanently, an object of divine love that will not let it go. The theological argument rests heavily on the nature of infinite versus finite. Universalists ask, how could a finite lifetime of choices, made by a limited, often confused, often wounded human being, justly warrant an infinite, unending consequence? And how could a God defined by infinite love reconcile that definition with the eternal, permanent loss of even a single creature made in that same God's image? For Universalists, The math doesn't hold. Infinite punishment for finite wrongdoing isn't justice, and permanent loss isn't compatible with a love described, in Christian scripture itself, as never giving up, never failing, and ultimately reconciling all things to itself. This isn't a theology of easy forgiveness without consequence. Universalist traditions typically still describe judgment, accountability, and genuine reckoning with the harm one has caused. What it removes is the finality, the permanent door closing on any soul forever. The reckoning exists to heal rather than to punish eternally. The fire refines rather than destroys. As you rest tonight, consider what it would mean to release the fear that any mistake, any wrong turn, any failure of character could permanently disqualify you from belonging, ultimately, to whatever is most loving in existence. The block universe. Time does not flow. Every moment that has ever happened or will ever happen already exists. This is the block universe theory, an interpretation of time taken seriously by many physicists as a direct consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity. Relativity demonstrated something deeply counterintuitive. There is no single, universal now shared by everyone in the universe. Whether two events happen at the same time depends on how fast you're moving relative to them, which means the neat separation we assume between past, present, and future isn't built into the physics of reality itself. It's a feature of human perception, not a feature of the universe. Under the block universe model, past, present, and future are all equally real, equally fixed, existing together in a single unchanging four-dimensional structure. And the sensation of time flowing is something generated by consciousness moving through the block, like a reading light moving across an already printed page. If this model is accurate, the implications for death become genuinely strange. Your death isn't an event that erases you from existence going forward. It's simply a boundary within the block, a specific coordinate where your particular experience of now stops moving. But every moment you were ever alive doesn't get deleted once you pass that boundary. It remains permanently, unchangeably real, exactly the way it always was, embedded forever in the structure of spacetime. In this sense, you don't stop existing when you die, you simply stop moving. The you that existed at every previous moment of your life is, under this model, exactly as real after your death as it was during your life, because it was never dependent on a flowing now to be real in the first place. This reframes grief in an unusual way. A loved one who has died, under the block universe model, hasn't been erased from reality. Every moment they were ever alive, every conversation, every ordinary Tuesday, remains permanently, literally, physically real within the fixed structure of the universe, no less real than this present moment feels to you right now. What's changed isn't their existence. It's simply that your particular position within the block no longer overlaps with theirs. Some physicists resist calling this comforting. A permanently fixed past doesn't restore anyone's ability to move forward with you. But others find something quietly profound in the idea that nothing you have ever lived, and no one you have ever loved, can actually be deleted from the fundamental structure of reality, no matter how far the block extends beyond the moment where your particular thread stops. This exact moment, the weight of the blanket, the sound of your own breathing, is not passing away as you experience it. It is being permanently, unchangeably etched into the structure of spacetime itself, as real 1,000 years from now as it is right now. But if all moments exist permanently within a fixed structure, what did an entirely different civilization on the other side of the world conclude happens to consciousness once it slips beneath that structure into the quiet, yellow dark below? Ancient Chinese Yellow Springs. In ancient Chinese cosmology, the dead did not ascend, they descended. Huanquan, the Yellow Springs, is one of the oldest recorded conceptions of the afterlife in Chinese thought, referenced in texts dating back over 2,000 years. Unlike many Western afterlife concepts organized around moral reward and punishment, The Yellow Springs functioned in early Chinese thought less as a place of judgment, and more as a parallel, shadowed mirror of the world above, an underground realm where the dead continued a kind of existence, governed by its own bureaucracy, its own rivers, its own rhythms, largely separate from questions of whether the deceased had lived a good or wicked life. The name itself comes from the color of groundwater found deep beneath the earth in parts of ancient China, a genuine, physical, yellow-tinged water that early cosmologists took as literal evidence that the underworld existed at a specific, findable depth below the living world. Unlike many afterlife traditions built entirely on faith or vision, the Yellow Springs was, for a period of Chinese history, treated as a place with actual physical geography, connected to the world above by real, if impassable, distance. Over centuries, as Buddhism and Taoism wove themselves more deeply into Chinese religious life, the Yellow Springs evolved and absorbed more elaborate concepts of judgment, ancestor veneration, and eventual reincarnation. But its earliest, most ancient form carries something distinct from many other traditions on this list: the sense that death led not to elsewhere exactly, but to underneath, a literal, physical, if inaccessible, layer of the same world you're currently standing on, rather than a separate cosmic plane entirely. This grounded, geographic quality shaped Chinese ancestor veneration practices for millennia. The dead weren't imagined as departed to some unreachable dimension, but as continuing nearby, beneath the very ground their descendants walked on, still reachable through ritual, still part of the family's ongoing life, still, in some sense, present rather than gone. There's something quietly moving in this framing. Grief, under the Yellow Springs cosmology, isn't organized around the idea that a loved one has traveled impossibly far away. It's organized around the idea that they've gone somewhere close, just beneath the surface, just out of reach, but not truly elsewhere. Feel the weight of the earth beneath the building you're resting in tonight. An ancient civilization's quiet certainty placed something golden and continuous just beneath your feet, closer than any other afterlife on this list has claimed to be. Biocentrism. You have the relationship between mind and universe exactly backward. Or so argues biologist Robert Lanza. Biocentrism proposes that life and consciousness are not incidental features that happen to emerge within an already existing physical universe, but are instead fundamental to the creation of the universe itself. Lanza draws heavily on the genuinely strange behavior of quantum mechanics. Specifically, experiments demonstrating that subatomic particles behave differently, existing in a probabilistic haze of possibility, until they are observed, at which point they collapse into definite, measurable states. Biocentrism takes this observer effect and extends it dramatically. If reality at its most fundamental level requires observation to take definite form, then consciousness isn't a passenger riding along inside an objective, pre-existing universe. It's the mechanism by which any coherent universe comes into being at all. Under this framework, space and time themselves are reframed, not as an external stage that consciousness happens to exist within, but as tools of biological perception, constructed by the observing mind to organize experience, the way a pair of glasses shapes what you see without being an objective feature of the world itself. Space and time are something more like modes of animal perception than fundamental properties of an external universe. Here's where biocentrism makes its most striking claim about death. If consciousness generates the framework of space and time, rather than existing within a pre-given space and time, then consciousness cannot be destroyed by anything happening within that framework, because consciousness is prior to the framework, not contained by it. Death, under this view, is something that happens to the body within space and time. But the awareness generating space and time in the first place was never, in this account, something that could be located inside the body to begin with, and therefore isn't something that could end when the body does. This is a deeply contested position within physics and biology. Most scientists consider biocentrism a significant overreach of quantum observer effects, which are typically understood as describing measurement interactions rather than literally requiring conscious minds. But the theory persists in popular imagination because it offers something genuinely rare, a framework for surviving death that doesn't require religious belief, souls, or the supernatural. Only a radical reordering of what's considered fundamental and what's considered derivative in the relationship between mind and matter. As you rest tonight, consider the strange intimacy of biocentrism's claim that the darkness behind your closed eyes right now isn't happening within some vast, indifferent universe out there. It might be the very fabric the universe is made of, briefly, quietly, taking the shape of you. But if consciousness might generate the very space and time it seems to exist within, one further theory suggests reality's true nature might be even stranger still. Not solid, not three-dimensional, but a projection, encoded entirely on a distant, flat surface far beyond anything we can directly perceive. The holographic principle. Imagine discovering that everything you perceive as solid, three-dimensional reality, your body, this room, the entire visible universe, is actually a kind of projection, encoded on a distant, two-dimensional surface. The way a hologram on a flat card can appear to leap out at you in full three-dimensional depth when the light hits it correctly, even though the actual information is stored flat. This is the holographic principle, a genuinely serious proposal in theoretical physics, developed initially by physicists Gerard T. Hooft and Leonard Susskind, arising from research into black holes. Physicists studying black holes discovered something bizarre. The amount of information a black hole can contain isn't proportional to its three-dimensional volume, as you'd expect. It's proportional to the two-dimensional area of its surface, its event horizon. This suggested something profound, that the information describing a three-dimensional region of space might be fully, completely encoded on the two-dimensional boundary surrounding it, with the three-dimensional experience being something closer to a projection generated from that flatter, more fundamental data. Extended to its furthest implications, some physicists have proposed that our entire universe might work this way, that the three-dimensional reality we experience, full of depth and physical volume, might be a kind of holographic projection, generated from information encoded on a distant, two-dimensional boundary at the edge of the observable universe. Under this model, three-dimensional space itself isn't fundamental. It's an emergent illusion, generated from flatter, more basic information, genuinely comparable, structurally, to how a video game generates a rendered three-dimensional world from underlying two-dimensional code. This connects to death in an unusual way. If your body, your brain, and the three-dimensional space you inhabit are all projections generated from more fundamental information encoded elsewhere on some distant boundary, in some deeper layer of reality, then death, as the ending of a three-dimensional, embodied experience, might not touch the more fundamental information the projection was generated from. The hologram can flicker off. The underlying code, the theory would suggest, doesn't necessarily go anywhere. Physicists are careful to note that the holographic principle, while taken very seriously in specific mathematical contexts like black hole thermodynamics and certain models of quantum gravity, remains unproven as a description of the entire observable universe. It's not settled science, but it has forced physicists to seriously reconsider whether three-dimensional space is truly fundamental to reality, or whether it's closer to an interface, useful, consistent, but not the deepest layer of what's actually going on. There's something almost soothing in the idea that the depth and solidity you feel right now, the weight of your body in the bed, the distance across the room, might be a beautifully rendered surface experience, generated from something flatter, stranger, and more permanent underneath, unreachable by anything that happens to the projection itself. As you rest tonight, Let your body feel just for a moment, less like solid matter and more like a projection, vivid, real to you, but perhaps not the deepest layer of what you actually are. But if reality might be a projection from a flatter, more fundamental layer, one cosmological model goes even further, proposing that the entire universe doesn't just project reality once, but recycles itself infinitely, eon after eon, each ending seamlessly becoming the next beginning. Conformal cyclic cosmology. Picture the heat death of the universe, that famously bleak, distant future where every star has burned out, every black hole has evaporated, and the cosmos has expanded into a cold, dark, featureless void, seemingly the most final and complete ending imaginable. Now picture a Nobel Prize-winning physicist looking at that ending and proposing something extraordinary, that this maximally empty, maximally expanded state isn't actually an ending at all. It's mathematically identical to a new beginning. This is conformal cyclic cosmology, proposed by physicist Roger Penrose, and it rests on a genuinely elegant piece of mathematics. As the universe expands toward its coldest, emptiest possible state, with nothing left but faint radiation and the slow evaporation of the last black holes, something curious happens to the mathematics describing that state. Because there's no more matter with mass left to provide any sense of physical scale, Penrose argues that this infinitely expanded, empty future becomes mathematically indistinguishable from an infinitely small, infinitely dense point. Precisely the kind of point cosmologists believe our own universe began from in the Big Bang. Under Penrose's model, this isn't merely a poetic coincidence. It's a genuine mathematical rescaling, the same underlying structure, viewed at two different scales, revealing that the end of one cosmic eon and the beginning of the next aren't actually separate events divided by some boundary. They're the same moment, described in two different units, seamlessly connected. The universe doesn't end and then, separately, restart. It transitions, continuously, from the vast emptiness of one eon directly into the fiery birth of the next, with no true gap between them at all. Penrose has even proposed a genuinely testable prediction arising from this model: faint circular patterns in the cosmic microwave background radiation, which he suggests could be the imprint of extremely energetic events, like colliding supermassive black holes, from the universe's previous eon, somehow bleeding through into our own. This claim remains contested and unconfirmed by the wider physics community, but it represents a rare case of a cyclic cosmology model making a prediction that could, in principle, be checked against actual observational data. What makes conformal cyclic cosmology so quietly profound isn't a claim about personal consciousness surviving from one eon to the next. Penrose makes no such claim. It's the deeper suggestion embedded in the mathematics, that ending and beginning might not be two different kinds of events at all, separated by some hard boundary, but the exact same event, depending entirely on the scale you're measuring it from. What looks from the inside like the most total and complete ending possible, every star dead, every structure dissolved, is, mathematically, indistinguishable from the most total and complete beginning possible. Consider how this reframes your own life's ending, even without any claim about personal continuity. If the universe's own most extreme ending is mathematically identical to its own beginning, perhaps the sharp line we draw between ending and beginning in our own lives says more about the scale we're viewing from than about anything fundamental in the structure of change itself. As you drift tonight, notice that the most extreme end you'll experience today, the total dissolution of waking awareness into sleep, is also, from tomorrow's perspective, simply the beginning of a new day viewed at a different scale. But if endings and beginnings might be mathematically identical at cosmic scale, what does the smaller, more intimate physics of entropy, the arrow of time itself, suggest about whether that arrow could ever, even briefly, run backward? Entropy reversal. Imagine watching a cup shatter on the floor, the shards scattering, the coffee soaking into the wood, and then imagine, impossibly, watching the entire sequence run in reverse. Shards leaping upward, coffee lifting off the floor, the cup reassembling itself, whole back on the table. This never happens in our experience, but physicists have long known there's no fundamental law of physics that actually forbids it. There's only overwhelming statistical improbability. This is the deep puzzle behind entropy reversal, rooted in the second law of thermodynamics, the principle stating that entropy, or disorder, always increases in a closed system over time. This law is why time seems to move in only one direction. Eggs break but don't unbreak. Ice melts but doesn't spontaneously refreeze into the exact shape of a cube. People age but don't grow younger. But here's the strange part physicists have grappled with for over a century. At the level of individual particle interactions, the fundamental laws of physics are almost entirely time-symmetric. They work equally well running forward or backward. Nothing in the underlying equations demands that time flow only one direction. The arrow of time we experience emerges not from a fundamental law, but from probability. There are vastly, overwhelmingly more disordered configurations a system can fall into than ordered ones. So systems drift toward disorder simply because disorder is statistically far more likely, not because it's fundamentally required. This opens a genuinely strange theoretical possibility. Given enough time, vast, almost incomprehensible stretches of time, far longer than the current age of the universe, statistical fluctuations could, in principle, cause entropy to spontaneously decrease in isolated regions, effectively running time backward within that region. It would be staggeringly unlikely. But staggeringly unlikely is not the same as impossible, and in a universe old enough or vast enough, staggeringly unlikely events are mathematically expected to occur somewhere eventually. Some physicists and philosophers have speculated about what this might mean for consciousness and death, if taken to its most extreme theoretical edge. If entropy can, in principle, spontaneously reverse in a given region, and if the specific arrangement of particles constituting a living brain is simply one particular low-entropy configuration among countless possible configurations, then an entropy-revering fluctuation, however astronomically improbable, could theoretically reconstruct that exact configuration, reassembling, in the most literal physical sense, a person, memories included, out of the surrounding disorder. The same way our reversed coffee cup theoretically could reassemble itself. This isn't a serious proposal for how anyone should expect to be resurrected. The odds involved are so vanishingly small they make winning every lottery on Earth simultaneously look like a coin flip. But it reveals something conceptually important. The forward march of time that makes death feel so final isn't, physicists increasingly emphasize, a hard law of the universe. It's the overwhelmingly most probable outcome of a system that happens, for statistical reasons, to almost always move in one direction, not a wall, but an extremely steep, extremely long hill. As you rest tonight, consider that the arrow carrying you forward through this life, moment by moment, toward its eventual end, isn't cutting through some fundamental law forbidding reversal. It's simply following the overwhelming statistical current of a universe that happens, for now, to be flowing one direction. But if physics allows even the theoretical possibility of reversal, what happens if the very thing generating your conscious experience of time flowing at all isn't located in the brain the way we assume, but in something far stranger, operating at the edge of quantum physics itself? Orchestrated objective reduction. Imagine that consciousness isn't produced by the firing of neurons the way most neuroscience assumes, the electrical and chemical signaling that textbooks describe as the seat of thought and awareness. Imagine instead that consciousness arises from something far smaller, far stranger, happening deep inside the neurons themselves, at the quantum level, inside microscopic structures too small for ordinary biology to have taken seriously until recently. This is orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCHUR, a genuinely controversial theory of consciousness developed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. The theory proposes that consciousness arises from quantum computations occurring within microtubules, tiny, tube-shaped protein structures found inside every neuron, traditionally understood as simple structural scaffolding for the cell, with no obvious connection to thought or awareness. Penrose and Hameroff argue instead that these microtubules are capable of sustaining quantum coherence, a delicate, synchronized quantum state, long enough to perform genuine quantum computations, and that consciousness emerges from a specific, orchestrated collapse of that quantum state, occurring in rhythmic pulses throughout the brain. This theory faces substantial skepticism from mainstream neuroscience and physics, largely because quantum coherence is famously fragile, typically collapsing almost instantly in warm, wet, chaotic biological environments like the inside of a living cell, conditions that seem, to most physicists, wildly inhospitable to sustained quantum effects. Penrose and Hameroff have proposed specific mechanisms by which microtubules might shield quantum states from this kind of interference, but the theory remains a minority position, not something close to scientific consensus. Here's where ORCHUR brushes against the deepest questions about death. Penrose's broader work in mathematical physics led him to propose that the objective reduction at the heart of consciousness, the moment quantum possibility collapses into a specific, experienced state, is tied to fundamental, irreducible properties of spacetime geometry itself, not merely to biological processes inside the brain. If this is accurate, then consciousness, under ORCHUR, isn't purely generated by the brain the way a fire is generated by burning wood. The brain becomes something closer to an antenna, orchestrating and tuning into quantum processes that are, at their deepest level, woven into the fundamental structure of spacetime, processes that may not be strictly dependent on the specific biological hardware of a living, functioning brain to exist. If consciousness is genuinely rooted in the fundamental geometry of spacetime rather than solely in biological neurons, the theory opens a speculative but genuinely serious question. Does consciousness require a living brain to exist at all? Or does the brain simply provide one particular, temporary way of orchestrating something more fundamental, something that might persist in some altered or diffuse form once that particular biological orchestration stops? Hameroff himself has speculated, more provocatively than Penrose, that near-death experiences might reflect quantum information in the microtubules becoming entangled with the broader geometry of spacetime, persisting even after the brain's biological functions cease. A genuinely fringe idea within an already controversial theory, but one that connects rigorous, published physics to some of the oldest intuitions about consciousness surviving the body. As you rest tonight, consider that somewhere inside every neuron currently generating this exact thought, there are structures small enough to touch the edge of quantum uncertainty, a scale where solid stops meaning anything simple, and where some of the universe's strangest, least understood physics might already be quietly at work, every night, every time you sleep. But if consciousness might be entangled with the fundamental structure of the universe itself, what does the strange fine-tuning of that universe's physical constants suggest about whether consciousness was ever meant to exist here in the first place, and what that implies for what comes after it? The Anthropic Principle. Imagine discovering that the fundamental constants governing our universe, the precise strength of gravity, the exact mass of an electron, the specific rate of cosmic expansion, are tuned with a precision so exact that even minuscule deviations, changes too small to easily imagine, would have made stars, chemistry, planets, and therefore any form of conscious life, completely impossible. This is the foundation of the Anthropic Principle, a genuinely serious area of study in cosmology and philosophy of physics, grappling with an uncomfortable observation. Our universe appears extraordinarily, suspiciously well-suited for the existence of conscious observers. The strong version of the Anthropic Principle suggests this fine-tuning isn't coincidental, that the universe must, in some sense, be structured in a way that guarantees the eventual emergence of conscious observers, whether through deliberate design or through a deeper, currently unknown physical necessity we haven't yet discovered. The more widely accepted weak version offers a subtler explanation. If our universe is just one among an enormous or infinite number of universes, each with different physical constants, then it's not surprising we find ourselves in one of the rare universes capable of supporting conscious life, because those are, definitionally, the only kinds of universes anyone would ever be around to observe and wonder about in the first place. Extending this reasoning toward the afterlife produces a genuinely strange thought experiment some physicists and philosophers have explored. If the fine-tuning required for consciousness to exist even once anywhere is this extraordinarily improbable, what does that suggest about whether consciousness, once it exists, is a uniquely fragile, one-time event, or whether the same deep structural necessity that made consciousness possible at all might make it, in some sense, difficult to fully eliminate from the universe once it's arisen? Some philosophers working in this space have proposed what's sometimes called the final anthropic principle, the highly speculative and contested idea that once conscious, information-processing life emerges in a universe, it may be structurally guaranteed to persist and expand throughout the remainder of that universe's existence, because the same fine-tuned conditions that made its emergence possible in the first place continue to favor its survival and propagation. This is a minority, heavily debated position, treated with real skepticism by most physicists, but it reframes an old question in genuinely new terms. Not does anything survive death, but does consciousness itself, once it has appeared anywhere in a universe this precisely tuned for its existence, represent something the universe's own fundamental structure resists fully losing? This connects, strangely, to the very fact that you exist to read this sentence at all. Every constant in the universe had to land within an extraordinarily narrow range for stars to form, for carbon to be forged in those stars' cores, for planets to condense, for chemistry complex enough to support life to emerge, for evolution to eventually produce a brain capable of asking whether any of this continues after death. The sheer number of ways this could have failed to happen at any step is almost incomprehensibly vast, and yet here you are. As you rest tonight, sit with the strange improbability embedded in your own existence, not as a person, but as a conscious observer in a universe tuned this precisely for consciousness to be possible at all. Whatever else is true about what follows death, the fact that awareness happened even once, against these odds, is already the strangest part of the story. But if the universe's fine-tuning raises questions about why anything exists at all, one further cosmological model asks an even more fundamental question. Not why the universe is tuned the way it is, but why there was ever a beginning, an edge, a boundary condition for it to be tuned within in the first place. The no-boundary proposal. Imagine trying to walk toward the North Pole and asking, once you arrive, what's further north than this? The question dissolves, not because there's a wall stopping you, but because further north simply stops being a meaningful direction once you've reached the pole itself. North wasn't infinite. It just smoothly rounded off into something that no longer has a further. This is the intuition behind the no-boundary proposal, developed by physicists Stephen Hawking and James Hartle, attempting to solve one of cosmology's strangest open questions. What happened before the Big Bang, and what, if anything, caused it? Traditional models of the universe's origin run into a genuinely uncomfortable wall extrapolating backward toward the Big Bang, The mathematics describing space and time break down entirely at a singularity, a point of infinite density where our physical laws simply stop making sense, refusing to say anything meaningful about what, if anything, came before it, or what caused it. Hartle and Hawking proposed something genuinely elegant to resolve this, using a mathematical technique that treats time, at the earliest moments of the universe, as behaving like an additional dimension of space rather than as ordinary time. Under this framework, as you trace the universe backward toward its beginning, time doesn't hit a wall or a singularity at all. It smoothly, gradually transitions into becoming indistinguishable from space itself. The way walking toward the North Pole doesn't hit a wall, but simply rounds off into a point where the concept of further north stops applying. Under the no-boundary proposal, asking what happened before the Big Bang becomes a bit like asking what's north of the North Pole. Not forbidden, but based on a category error, because before the Big Bang, time in the ordinary sense that makes before meaningful, didn't yet exist in a form where the question applies. This has genuinely profound implications for the concept of beginnings and endings more broadly. If the universe has no true boundary at its start, no singular moment of creation from nothing, no edge where time truly begins, then the philosophical weight we place on beginnings and endings might be, in some deep sense, an artifact of living inside a small, local stretch of a structure that doesn't actually have the sharp edges we assume it does. Extending this reasoning, speculatively, toward personal death, if the universe's own beginning turns out not to be a hard boundary but a smooth, boundaryless rounding off, some philosophers of physics have wondered whether our intuitive picture of death as a hard boundary, a wall where you stop and nothing continues, might rest on the same kind of category error the no-boundary proposal resolves at the cosmic scale, not proof of anything continuing, but a genuine challenge to the assumption that boundaries, endings, and beginnings are as sharp and absolute as they intuitively feel. Hawking himself, notably, didn't believe personal consciousness survived death in any traditional sense. He was famously direct about this. But the mathematics he helped develop, applied originally to the birth of the entire universe, offers a genuinely different way of thinking about what an edge actually is, and whether the edges we assume exist at the start of the universe, and perhaps at the end of a life, are as absolute as they feel from the inside. As you rest tonight, consider the edge of sleep itself, that threshold you're approaching right now, which, like the North Pole, doesn't actually feel like a wall from the inside. It simply, smoothly, rounds off into something where the ordinary rules briefly stop applying. But if even the universe's own beginning might lack a true boundary, what happens if reality's deepest layer isn't made of energy, particles, or fields at all, but of pure information, computed, processed, and rendered, the way a program renders a world from underlying code? Digital physics. Imagine peering deep enough into the fundamental structure of matter, past atoms, past quarks, past every particle physics has ever discovered, and finding, at the very bottom, not smaller particles at all, but something closer to code. Discrete units of information, processed according to simple rules, generating everything else: particles, forces, space, time, the way pixels, and processing generate an entire rendered world inside a video game. This is digital physics, a genuinely serious research program pursued by physicists including Edward Fredkin and Stephen Wolfram, proposing that the universe, at its most fundamental level, might not be continuous and analog the way classical physics traditionally assumed, but discrete and computational, built from something closer to information processing than to continuous matter and energy. Proponents point to genuinely suggestive features of physical reality. Energy comes in discrete packets. Quantum mechanics is fundamentally probabilistic in ways that resemble computational processes, and the laws of physics themselves are expressible as remarkably simple, elegant, rule-based mathematical structures. Precisely the kind of structure you'd expect if reality were generated from an underlying computational process, rather than existing as continuous, uncomputed substance. Wolfram's research, in particular, has explored whether astonishingly simple computational rules, iterated over enormous numbers of steps, could generate structures complex enough to produce everything we observe in physics: space, time, particles, and potentially consciousness itself, emerging not as fundamental features of reality, but as complex patterns arising from a much simpler underlying computational substrate. The way staggeringly intricate patterns can emerge from remarkably simple rules in cellular automata. If digital physics is correct, the implications for death and consciousness become genuinely strange. Your consciousness, under this framework, wouldn't be a byproduct of biological matter in any traditional sense. Biological matter itself would already be a pattern generated from deeper computational processes. Consciousness would be, more precisely, a very complex self-referential pattern within that computation. And patterns, unlike physical objects, have a genuinely different relationship to persistence and deletion. A pattern can, in principle, be paused, reproduced, transferred, or reconstructed, possibilities that don't obviously apply to physical matter in the same way. This connects to some of the most serious contemporary discussions in philosophy of mind around consciousness uploading and pattern identity. The idea that if you are, fundamentally, an informational pattern rather than a specific arrangement of physical atoms, questions of continuation after death become less about whether your specific atoms persist, and more about whether the pattern that constitutes your particular consciousness could, even theoretically, be reconstructed, continued, or exist redundantly elsewhere within whatever computational substrate is generating reality. None of this is remotely settled science. Digital physics remains a minority, actively contested position, and most physicists still consider space, time, and matter to be fundamentally continuous rather than computational. But the theory forces a genuinely useful reframing. It asks whether you are more accurately described as a specific arrangement of matter, bound tightly to that matter's continued existence, or as a pattern of information, which might have a more flexible, less final relationship with any single physical substrate. As you rest tonight, consider your own thoughts right now as a pattern rather than a substance, and notice how strange, how genuinely open, the question of what happens to a pattern once its current substrate stops running actually becomes. But if you might be a pattern rather than a substance, what would it mean if that pattern was never truly isolated to begin with? If it was always, quietly, part of something vastly larger, something some traditions have simply called the Great Memory. The Great Memory. Imagine, for our final and strangest possibility, that nothing is ever truly lost. Not a single thought, not a single moment of joy or grief, not a single conversation whispered in the dark. Imagine that everything that has ever happened everywhere to everyone is somehow recorded, not in a book, not on a server, but in the very fabric of existence itself, accessible in ways we've mostly forgotten how to access. This is the Great Memory, a concept appearing in various forms across mystical and philosophical traditions, sometimes called the Akashic records in theosophical thought, sometimes echoed in Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, sometimes appearing in indigenous oral traditions describing ancestors as continuously present within the memory of the land, the water, and the living community itself. Stripped of any single tradition's specific vocabulary, the Great Memory proposes something quietly radical. That memory, and by extension identity and experience, might not be strictly contained within individual brains at all, but might exist as a kind of substrate underlying reality itself. A field, a record, a resonance that individual minds tap into during life and rejoin more fully once the boundary of the individual body dissolves. Jung, working as a psychiatrist rather than a mystic, arrived at a strikingly similar structure through clinical observation, rather than religious tradition, noticing recurring symbols, myths, and archetypal patterns appearing across cultures and individuals with no possible direct contact, leading him to propose a collective unconscious, a layer of psyche shared across all of humanity, deeper than individual memory, from which individual minds draw and to which they contribute. Jung stopped short of claiming this collective layer survives physical death in any literal sense, but the structure he proposed, a shared, continuous layer of mind underlying individual, temporary minds, echoes almost precisely what older mystical traditions described in more explicitly metaphysical language. Under the great memory framework, death doesn't represent the deletion of a life's accumulated experience. It represents instead a kind of merging, the temporary, individuated stream of your particular consciousness, with its particular joys and sorrows and small, unrepeatable details, folding back into the vast, permanent record it was always quietly drawing from and contributing to. The way a single wave, cresting and dissolving, doesn't erase the water it was made of, but returns it, fully intact, back into an ocean that remembers every wave that has ever risen from it. This theory doesn't ask to be believed in the way a scientific hypothesis asks to be tested. It asks something gentler, that you consider whether every insight you've ever had that felt somehow larger than your own individual thinking, every moment of unexplainable connection with a stranger, every dream carrying symbols you never consciously learned, might be small, ordinary evidence of a deeper memory you've always had partial, imperfect access to, without ever fully realizing it. As you finally let go into sleep tonight, at the end of this long journey through 25 ways of imagining what waits beyond this life, consider that you are not simply a temporary flicker of awareness, isolated and alone, destined for simple deletion. Across every theory we've walked through tonight, the quantum, the cosmic, the mystical, the mathematical, a single thread keeps reappearing. The boundary between you and everything else might be far softer, far more provisional, than it feels from inside a single, tired body at the end of a long day. You are perhaps a wave cresting briefly, magnificently, unrepeatably in the shape of exactly this life, exactly these thoughts, exactly this moment of drifting toward rest. And whether what comes next is another branch, another eon, another rendering, a merging with everything, or simply, peacefully, nothing at all, you have spent this one, this only, this entirely real life, being something the universe has never quite managed to be before, and will never manage to be in exactly this way again. Rest now. Whatever waits on the other side of sleep tonight, and whatever waits on the other side of the longer sleep someday, you don't have to solve it before you're allowed to let go. Sleep now, carried gently by every theory and none of them, held by a universe that, in at least one of these 25 strange and beautiful stories, was always going to keep you.